Yud Aleph of the Evan Shelaima, which is talking about different aspects of Mashiach and Geula. Second here. So the last thing that we looked at, you'll remember, is Perek Yud Aleph Sif Vav, that talked about three components of grain. We have what is called the motes. Motes is the chaff or the husk around the kernel. Then we have the teven, which is the straw. And then we have the subin, which is the bran. That's actually, it's edible, the bran. And the Vilna Gaon said that Klal Yisrael is called tfuah. They are called the grain of Hashem. Kodesh Yisrael Hashem. Reishis Tevuaso, Rashi brings it in Chumash. And therefore, kishem that there are three components of Tevuah, there's also three components in Klal Yisrael, or connected to Klal Yisrael. And he basically says the straw is Esav, the Kayach of Esav, that's Ma'aravinas. And the chaff, the motes, is Yishmael. And they will be handled by Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. Mashiach ben Yosef will destroy Esav, and Mashiach ben David will be Miskaber over Yishmael. But then the subin is the most closely attached to the grain. It's actually part of the edible part of the grain itself. Although today we treat it as a health food, but subin was considered to be a product that you would want to get rid of. So that represents the Erev Rav, which is actually a chelek of Klal Yisrael itself. And we discussed Bi'arichas that it may not necessarily mean the physical descendants of the Erev Rav, although some people understand it that way, but it refers to the spiritual pagamim of the Erev Rav are really part of us, and that will actually prevent Mashiach from coming, meaning to say, Esav and Yishmael will be handled by Mashiach. But Lagabi the Subin, it says, Ein ben David ba, Mashiach cannot come until we get rid of many of those characteristics, which is an interesting, it kind of throws the analogy a little bit out of focus, because normally when you thresh grain, you first get rid of the teven and the motes, and then the subin. But here we have to get rid of the subin first. The subin will prevent the geula from coming. Once we get, that's the Erev Rav, once we get rid of the subin, when I say get rid of, I'm including tshuva and the like. So then we are ready to get rid of the teven and the mites. But again, the idea here is that Mashiach ben Yosef will be miskaber over Esav, pave the way for Mashiach ben David, and then Mashiach ben David will be miskaber over Malchus Yishmael. And this goes with the idea that although Chazal talked about four exiles, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome, but later Midrash and Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer and then Rav Chaim Vital talked about Yishmael being the very last of the Gullus. That's Bi'acharis Hayamim, and Malchus Yishmael will be Miskaber, and that's actually what we're seeing today, Mamish, as we talk. And that will not be fully defeated until Mashiach ben David. Now, what that means exactly is you're not entirely clear. Does that mean like right before Mashiach ben David comes, or does it mean there has to be Mashiach and then it gets defeated? It's not boror exactly what the sequence is. But the Gra says Geula cannot come as long as we have the Erev Rav attached to us. And as I say, that refers primarily to the destructive Midah and attributes of the Erev Rav. So I want to go a little further with that. So that was Sif Vav. Now then, in Sif Zayin, just going in order at this point, Sif Zayin says the following: Lefi shahadayrais mismatin v'helchim. As the generations move, mismatim, we seem to get diminished. This is the famous idea of niskatnu hadayris. Now you have to understand what niskatnu hadayris means. Niskatnu hadayris doesn't mean necessarily that, every shoemaker in the time of the Amoraim was 1,000 times greater than the Vilna Gaon. That wasn't true. I mean, if the Vilna Gaon would have been in the time of the Amoraim, he at least would have been a chashuv balabas. I mean, for sure. Okay, so it's not like every single person of earlier generations was greater than every single person of later generations. But we're dealing more or less with an average, meaning apples to apples, oranges to oranges. The Friedika Gedolim were greater than the Gedolim today. And the average balabas was greater. In other words, it's a comparable type of comparison. But still, overall, there is an iskatnu hadeiros. And therefore, what is the consequence? V'ha'erev rav miskabrim. So we get hit with a double whammy. The Kedusha is less and less and less. And the Erev Rav, which you'll recall, the Vilna Gaon said, actually that's in Sifches, but we learned it already, that the Erev Rav are those components in Klal Yisrael that are Balei Machlokes v'Lashon Hara, number 1. Number 2, Balei Taiva. Number 3, hypocrites. Number 4, Reit V'Machar Kavod. Number 5, Reit V'Machar Mammon. So whatever these midos are, they're a miskaber. So the Kedusha goes lower, and these midos get stronger and stronger and stronger. So l'chayra, we're getting into a trap that we can't get out of. So he says, Lefikach, Hutztrachu chachmei hadairais b'chol dor v'dor ligzor gezeirais v'seyagim chadoshim ligdor hapirtze sheportzo erev rav. This is a very, very interesting question. Everyone knows that we have mitzvahs d'oraisa and we have many, many gezeiros midrabanan that were added at different times. So if you were to look at what people were allowed to do, whatever, 2,000 years ago, they were allowed to do many, many things that a religious Jew would never do today. There was no law of muktzah, for example. You could eat chicken and milk. They didn't make a gezerah of meat and milk. Many, many things. Even things like kol isha, according to many opinions, is midrabanan. So you were allowed to hear a woman singing. There was no problem. So people sometimes like, why do the rabbis, whoever the rabbis are, let's say the Sanhedrin, just to make it simple, why do they make life so much harder? What was wrong with the Judaism of Moshe Rabbeinu? What was wrong with the Judaism of Yoshua bin Nun or David HaMelech? Why are we mechuyev to make things harder and harder and harder and harder? Now we can add that this is not only true in terms of mamish rabbinic laws like gezeros and takanas, but generally speaking, a religious life tends to get stricter, more insular. And people criticize this, maybe for some reason. They say, for example, why does Mishpacha magazine, I don't even know if it's true, but they don't run any picture of a woman, right? They'll have a picture of a cabinet meeting, and Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and like everybody's face can be seen in the picture except Hillary Clinton. She gets blocked out or whatever it is. There actually was such a thing as that. Yeah. Why? Why do we do these things? They didn't do it 50 years ago. They didn't do it 100 years ago. So the Vilna Gaon is suggesting a possible answer to that. The Vilna Gaon is suggesting that as the dairis get lower and lower in Kedusha, and as the inyanim of the Erev Rav get miskaber, we need to be stricter than we would have to have been 100 years ago, because we have to fight a certain tuma that would otherwise defeat us. So it might be, 100 years ago, a person could sit next to a woman on a bus. I'm just giving you an example. Sit next to a woman, but today we might say, again, I'm not expressing personal opinions, I'm just saying a yanim of hashkafa. We might say today it's not proper, perhaps, because people have hirhurim, people have yetzer haras, people are spiritually weaker. And when you're spiritually weaker, you need to take stronger medicine. So it's not that we're frummer than our grandparents, the other way around. Because we're less frum, we need to have stricter rules. You need stricter rules when bedafka you don't have the ruchnius and the kedusha that backs you up. This is a very interesting horror that the Vilna Gaon is making, that because of niskatnu hadairais and because of the hiskabris of the Erev Rav, the Chachamim saw reasons to make stricter fences and gedarim in order that we shouldn't be nichshal, even though at an earlier time in history we could have gone in those places, and it wouldn't have affected us so much, right? So if you have an aunt or whoever asking, how come the rabbis are making all of these rules? So you now have some svara that you can give to explain how that works. Meaning, so it's not that we're better than the Friyadikadairis, we're worse than the Friyadikadairis. Memela, we need to be stricter. We need to be stricter and avoid certain things that an earlier generation could handle, and we cannot. I mean, I'll give you one example. The Gemara itself, I mean, you can learn it differently, but the Mishnah discusses the types of avelis that's mutter on Chol HaMoed. Let's say, Chas v'shalom, somebody dies, they're buried on Chol HaMoed. What are you allowed to do on Chol HaMoed? Of course, you bury the mace, that's for sure. So it mentions that they used to have women who would sing at Levayas, and there were different ways they would sing. Sometimes they would sing in unison, and sometimes they would sing responsively. So the Mishnah says certain things caused more crying than other things, so we let them sing, but they shouldn't do responsibly because that's ma'ira b'chiyah. So the one thing you might wonder is, women singing at funerals? I haven't seen that at Harav Menuchos. What, a bunch of women singing at funerals? What's going on? So some people want to be daicha. Well, that's talking about a woman died and there's only women at the funeral. But again, that's a daicha. I mean, usually, if a woman dies, there'll be some man at the funeral, whatever it would be. But the reality is that, Kol Isha B'chiyai Gavna was mutter at the time, because since it was in the tzura of Avelis and sadness, they were on the madrega where it wouldn't come to Kalas Reish and it wouldn't come to improper thought. So a woman could sing at a funeral, at least if it's more than one woman. B'zman hazeh, we wouldn't do such a thing. You'll ask me, Akasha, if the Mishnah said it was mutter, then who are we to say not to do such a thing? Answer, the Vilna Gaon, that sometimes we have to be stricter, precisely because we live in more of an immoral culture, and we are influenced by that culture, and therefore we need to be stricter than earlier generations needed to be. Right? That's a hagdara. Now, some people might disagree with that philosophy, okay, but this is what the Gra is teaching us, that this is a yesod that we can look at. Okay. Trying to think, there's a Saporno that says Kemat the same thing. The Saporno says, he has a whole arichas on the Musafim of Sukkos, right? The Musafim of Sukkos are a very unusual Musaf, very different than any Yom Tov. First you have the Parim, the bulls of Sukkos. Unusual, number one, both numerically and how they go. You have 70 bulls, and they go down in descending order. Day 1, 13, 12, 11, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. And then the kvasim, the sheep that you bring, is you bring 14 sheep, 14 kvasim. So the Saporno says like this. The Saporno says that 7 represents the cycle of time, 7 days in a week. Sheep represents obedience, like, sheep just obey. They're not like goats, right? Not big enough to mean that. If you're debating, should you raise sheep or goats, you have to ask yourself, it's almost like a dog-cat thing, right? Sheep are very obedient, because they're not that intelligent. Goats are very independent, right? So when we talk about blind obedience, we use sheep as a mashal for that. So the Saporno says 7 sheep represents the blind obedience of Klal Yisrael in the 7 days of the week. Now, why 14? Because we have 2 blind obediences. We have the blind obedience to the Doraisas, and we have the blind obedience to the Drabanans. And therefore, these 14 sheep are Merames, says the Saporno, to Klal Yisrael's obedience throughout the cycle of 7 days to Drabanans and Doraisas. So the Saporno then says, well, why is that connected to Sukkot? I mean, you might as well do that every day. Like, well, why are you giving the remez to Drabanans and Doraisas on the holiday of Sukkot? So he says that Sukkot, even more than Pesach, is a remez to the Messianic era, Yemosha Mashiach, Gog uMagog, Sukkot. So Memela, there's a remez here that as we approach Mashiach, we're going to have more and more restrictions and rules that we have to obey in order to make us ro'i for Mashiach. So this is part of Shema saying the same idea, that the obedience will have to be increased because of Niskatnu Hadairais in order to be Zocha to a Messianic redemption. So that's Ke'ilu, the same Svara the Graph says here. Where's this from? So the Makor for this Yisai is not from Mishlei. Most of the Eben Shleim is taken from Mishlei, but this is from the Parish of the Gra on the Tikunei Zayar. Right? Tikunei Zayar is a chelak of the Zayar. Okay. Sifches we looked at more than once. That's the Erev Rav, the 5 categories of Erev Rav, which we already looked at. So now I'm going to go to Tes. Okay, this is Perek Yud Aleph, Sif Tes. And he says, B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation, Sholeit Midah Acheres, Mimidaisav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu shemanig behem olamai. Shemizeh mishtanim hativim. Okay, so this is really a very, very profound idea that needs a tremendous arichas. The Eben Shleim is not myrich on it at all, just says it in very bare bones, and there's a lot that one can develop with this. That is, this goes back to the idea that world history is supposed to have 6 millennia, right? Maximum, 6,000 years. And then Gula has to come. Gula can come earlier, but no later than the year 6,000. That's why the Torah says the Jewish calendar has been calculated only until the year 6,000. Why? Because we are batuach that by the year 6,000 we'll have a Sanhedrin, and they're going to be Makadesh al Pi Re'iyah, and they're no longer going to work with an automatic calendar. Right? We need a calendar only when we don't have Eidim and a Sanhedrin. Now you may ask me the question, what do I mean, or what does the Torah mean, that the Jewish calendar only goes up to the year 6,000? What does that mean? We have calculations, and with those calculations I could calculate when Pesach will be in 1,000,000 years, in 10 million years, in 1,000,000,000,000 years, because there's a pattern. So what do you mean the calendar only goes up to the year 6,000? Well, alibi the emes it does, because here's the problem, at least the way the Ramban is masber it. The problem is that what makes Rosh Chodesh is not the calendar. What makes Rosh Chodesh is the Kiddush based in Al Pi Eidim. And that's why, even when the Beis Din made a mistake, that's a famous Mishnah, and they make Rosh Chodesh the wrong day, Yom Kippur or the Chag is from the wrong day, not from the right day. Because the wrong day becomes the right day. In other words, unlike Shabbos, which is determined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rosh Chodesh was Masor to the Sanhedrin. And even if they make a mistake, that's Kaveya Rosh Chodesh. That's why on Shabbos we say, Baruch Atah Hashem, Mekadesh HaShabbos. And for Yom Tov we say Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. It's Mekadesh Yisrael who is Mekadesh the Zmanim. And when it's Shabbos and Yom Tov, Mekadesh, it's very exact. Mekadesh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim. So that raises a very simple question. If that's the case, then why do we keep Yom Tov today at all? We don't have a Sanhedrin that's Mekadesh Rosh Chodesh. Yeah, astronomically we know when Rosh Chodesh is, but so what? Astronomy is not Kaveya Rosh Chodesh. The Sanhedrin is Kaveya Rosh Chodesh. We don't have a Sanhedrin. So why is there Yom Tov at all? Shabbos I understand, because Shabbos does not depend on anything we do. But why Yom Tov? Because Yom Tov, you understand, Yom Tov depends on Rosh Chodesh. Every Yom Tov is X number of days from a Rosh Chodesh. Pesach is the 15th, of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah is the 1st of Tishrei. Sukkot is the 15th of Tishrei. But you have to have a Rosh Chodesh. Without a Rosh Chodesh, there's no Yom Tov. So this is a huge machlokes Rishonim. Some Rishonim say It's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai that when you have a Sanhedrin, Reish Chodesh depends on Kiddush Beis Din, and when you don't have a Sanhedrin, it depends on Cheshbon. In other words, it's Tamazai. There's Cheshbon and there's Sanhedrin. But Ramban says differently. Ramban says the requirement of Sanhedrin is l'dairei dairis. Elamai. No, the Sanhedrin continued even after the Churban for around 200 years. But the last Nasi was called Hillel Hasheni. He was the great, great, great grandson of Hillel. He and his Sanhedrin calculated all the Roshei Chadashim in advance, and they were Makadish them. It's like, imagine, I don't know what it looked like, but imagine that you had, how many, you have 12 Rosh Chodeshes a year, right? So 12 times, 3,000 years or 5,000 years, whatever it is. So they have to sit, they spent a day or 2 days or 3 days saying, okay, we are Makadesh, this Rosh Chodesh for Tufshin, Ayin, Tufshin Ayin Aleph, Tufshin, right, and they were Makadesh it. So, quite literally, they were only Makadesh it up to the year 6000, which Taka means the calendar does expire. Meaning, if counterfactually, it won't happen, Mashiach wouldn't come by the year 6000, we would no longer have any Yomim Tovim. We would not keep Pesach, we would not keep Sukkot, we would not keep Yom Kippur, we would not keep Rosh Hashanah, because even if astronomically we know the dates, there's no Kiddush HaChodesh. Without Kiddush HaChodesh, right? So this is a big machlekes. Like Rav Sadia Gaon, I think it's Rav Sadia Gaon, he Taka says that when you don't have a Sanhedrin, the Kedusha of Rosh Chodesh comes from the Cheshvan itself. So there wouldn't be a problem. But the Ramban learns not the way. The Ramban learns the Kiddush HaChodesh comes from a Maisa Kiddush Beis Din. But what's interesting is they could be Makadesh in advance, meaning they don't have to wait till they see a new moon. They could be Makadesh 1,000 years before that Rosh Chodesh, and they could declare 1,000 years from now that a certain day will be Rosh Chodesh, and that's the meaning of the calendar expiring, right? So that's just an interesting yesod that, although someone asked me a very good kasha once years ago, I told him, he said like this, he said, well, in a way, the idea that Mashiach has to come by the year 6000, kind of a brilliant question, he says, is a meaningless statement. Because what does that mean? That means if it's 5,999 and Mashiach doesn't come, then it never becomes the year 6000 because there's no Kiddush HaChodesh for that Rosh Hashanah. So if there's no Kiddush HaChodesh for that Rosh Hashanah, then you're still in the old year of 5,999 will last forever until Mashiach comes. So yeah, Mashiach has to come by the year 6000. But if he doesn't come by the year 6000, it's not the year 6000. He kind of stumped me. I actually don't have a complete teretz for that one, unless the concept is, at least Lagabe counting years. Maybe counting years is different than counting months. Maybe counting years may be an astronomical fact, even though you don't have the Kedusha of Chadoshim. I don't know, maybe that would be the, in other words, it would still be year 6000 without the Kedusha of Rosh Chodesh. That might be a possibility, but I'm not sure. Okay, do you want to say?
Yeah. Even during the time when they had a Sanhedrin, if there was no Adam that came, wouldn't the months still change if no one, like after the second day?
No, they had to be Makadesh. They had to be Makadesh. They would be Makadesh. You're correct. They would be Makadesh it, even without Adam. That's true. But they would be, but they would have to be Makadesh it. At least that was Machlekes in the Mishnah. But that's how we pass. Yeah, there's a Mandi Amar that says the second day automatically becomes. But the Ramban is paskening like the other opinion. Now, all right, so that's Kiddush HaChodesh. Now, what? So we have 6 millennia. So here's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says each 1,000 years of history corresponds to 1 day of creation. We have 6 millennia of history at a maximum, and it corresponds. Right, so the beginning of the world till the year 1000 is Yom Rishon. From the year 1001 to 2000 is Yom Sheni. And therefore he says, you should be able to see, and the Gra himself doesn't fully explain it, but you should be able to see in each millennium of history something that corresponds to what was done on that day. Because we know that Yomai Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a day of God, is defined as 1,000 years. David HaMelech says, Ki elef shanim b'yinecha kayem esma. Right? 1,000 years in your eyes, God, is like one day. Yep. So the Gra says, therefore, that in every millennium, every 1,000 years that corresponds with Yomai Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is a different aspect of Hashem's Midah that is Sheleit. Meaning Hashem has all of these Midos. Rachamim and Din and Chesed and Tiferet and Netzach. And really all of these Midos are working all the time. But there are tekufos in which a certain Midah becomes dominant. And that changes not only from, well, in the biggest way, millennium to millennium, but it also changes within the century and within the years. Like different midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are sholei at different times. Now again, this is never to the total exclusion. You know, there's never a time that is kulo chesed, and Baruch Hashem, there's never a time that is kulo death. But things become dominant, things become ascendant at different times. So what's interesting is, the Gra says, that since different midas of Hashem are sholeit in different tekufas, then the avodah that we need to emphasize mitzidenu may differ from tekufa to tekufa. Because our avodah has to be that which is optimal to elicit the dominant midah of Hashem in that tekufa. Now, again, this is an idea that's not fully explained, but it's a fascinating idea because it brings out an issue that people have about, can Judaism change in any way? Is there such a thing as change? Right? You hear the word change, so you automatically think about all the bad stuff, reform and all the treif stuff, and you think about one of the Yud Gimel Ikrei Hamuna is the Torah will never change, right? So of course, can Judaism change? Of course Judaism cannot change. If someone tries to change Judaism is a liar. Either a liar or is not informed. No, but it's not, there's no such thing as legitimate change. And yet, we do see notions of chidushim in Avodas Hashem. I mean, let's take Chassidus. Right? Chassidus started whenever it is, the mid-1700s, Baal Shem Tov. Now, we know that there was a lot of opposition to Chassidus. And the Gra himself had quite a lot of opposition to Chassidus. In some ways, the Nefesh HaChaim, although he never says anything negative about Chassidus per se, but the whole Nefesh HaChaim was essentially written as a polemical argument against Chassidus by emphasizing Limud HaTorah and doing mitzvahs kahalacha as opposed to emphasizing the kavanah of a mitzvah, right? Because Chassidus was saying the most important thing is Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. So if you're a little late for Kriya Shema, what's the big deal? There was such an idea. Yeah. What does Hashem want? Kriya Shema Bizmana when you're half asleep, or Gavaldiga Kriya Shema with kavanah at 11:30 in the day? So never push it. A Kriya Shema at 11:30 with kavanah is worth more than a Kriya Shema without kavanah at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's what early Chassidus said. And the Nefesh HaChaim, as you know, is B'dafka, writes over and over and over against that. Okay, so there was a machlokes, etc. But Lamaisa, Chassidus on some level became a kubal in Klal Yisrael as a derech of Avodas Hashem. I understand that there'll be individual things that we argue with, but no, Chassidus, Musar, Kabbalah, right? All of a sudden, Kabbalah. Now, it's true, we say Kabbalah always existed, but the truth is the Ari was certainly Machadesh in Kabbalah. There's no question. The Ari was not just telling over what he was Makabel from a Rebbe or something. The Ari was Machadesh. Even in learning. I mean, interesting question. We talk about Rav Chaim's derech, like the whole Litvische derech of limud in yeshivas is essentially miyusad with many, many inputs, but it's essentially miyusad on Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. It's an amazing thing. One man changed the whole tzura of learning in the Litvish non-Hasidic yeshivas. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. Now, of course, there are many variations, as Talmidim went in all different directions. You have Rav Baruch Ber, you have Rav Shimon, you have Rav Elchanan, you have the Chazon Ish, then Kohen Shmuel Rozovsky, I mean, all of them. But they are, the Brisker Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, Rav Yecheskel Avramsky. All of these great names that we hear for the past 100 years. They are directly, indirectly, Talmidim or Talmidei Talmidim of Rav Chaim. Now, Rav Chaim died in 1918. Rav Chaim didn't die like, 500 years ago. So Elamai, Rav Chaim created a new derech of limud. What do you mean, new derech of limud? I mean, Brisk would be the first people that would throw you out if you said, oh, we changed things, new things. What do I mean, new things? Chadash, like the Chasam Sofer said, it's a pun. There's a statement, Chadash Asher Min HaTorah, which is not referring, Chadash means, new grain until you bring the Eimer, you're not allowed. So the Chasam Sofer used that as the watchword against the Reform movement. Chadash Asher Min HaTorah. This was the saying that he used, right? So there's something that's very, very subtle, and that is, within the parameters of Messiah, there is a lot of room for chidushim, for expansion, for re-emphasis, for bringing out certain ideas that were always there, but they were not emphasized. So, in many ways, Chassidus didn't invent anything new. Chassidus re-emphasized certain ideas that had receded. Musar, the same thing. Kabbalah. So, this is actually explained. Maybe I shouldn't explain the legitimacy of Chassidus by using the Vilna Gaon, because he had a lot of problems with Chassidus. The Vilna Gaon is saying that since there are different Midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that are sholate in the world at different times, the Avodah itself must be readjusted to correspond to the dominant Midah that is sholate in the time. Now, the obvious question is, well, how on earth am I supposed to know? The answer is, we don't know. But this is what a gadol does. In other words, when gedolim are madrich Am Yisrael to emphasize certain aspects, that comes from their chush that this is what this generation needs, and it's based on the idea that in Ruchnius Hashem's hashgacha manifests itself in different ways with different midas. And therefore the Avodah has to be adjusted within, of course, the parameters of Torah mitzvahs, adjusted with certain emphasis. See, and this is really one of the main jobs that Gadol has b'Yisrael, is to kind of understand what the door needs in its relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, new things are going to be emphasized. To give you a small example, there were Sifrei Musar, very famous Sifrei Musar, that talked a lot about Gehenna, and they talked a lot about all of the awful punishments that sinners are going to go through. One of the most famous Musar Svarim, written by a Talmud of the Arizal, was the Reishis Chachma. I mean, it's around. You can get a Reishis Chachma. And Reishis Chachma has a shar that's called Shar HaGehenim, which most people, wouldn't want to read. It's there. Now, most Gedolim, most Mashgichim today have actually encouraged their Talmidim not to be ma'ayin in those svarim. Because today we're a weaker generation, this Katnu Adairis, and as a result, if we get scared, we get terrified, so we get depressed, we feel hopeless, and instead of it motivating us to grow in Avodas Hashem, it actually discourages us. So as a result, Yiddishkeit is emphasizes today by most people. There are some notable, famous internet exceptions. But there is, it emphasizes more, God's love, God's care. Now, the people on the other side accuse that of, oh, you're just faking it, you're creating warm and fuzzy, when Yiddishkeit is not just warm and fuzzy. But the answer is Yiddishkeit is everything. Yiddishkeit is love, and Yiddishkeit is rachamim, and Yiddishkeit is God's empathy for us, and Yiddishkeit is also midas adin and accountability. It's all of those things together. It's not either or. But different midas are shaylet at different times, and therefore the door needs different types of avodah for different times. That would be an example of that. You know, Rabbi Reisman, not the former Rosh Kollel, but Rabbi Yisrael Reisman from New York, Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das. So he comes here every summer. So I remember him saying, he was a Talmud of Torah V'das, and his Rebbe was Rav Pam. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I mean, a gadol, but also tremendous, tremendous Baal Midas. You know, Rav Pam started his career, by the way. His whole career was in Torah V'das. His whole life was in Torah V'das. But his first years, he was the 9th grade math teacher. He wasn't even a Rebbe. He taught math to 9th grade. He was in Kollel part of the day, and he taught math the rest of the day. And there were people around a few years ago who actually had him as he was their math teacher. And they say, you know, whether he was teaching Gemara or teaching math, there was always such a midah, such an ehrlichkeit, such a kindness. You know, he was the same in every job that he had. But Rav Reisman mentioned that Rav Pam would tell him, you're not allowed to learn Mesilas Yesharim even. Now, Mesilas Yesharim, many consider that to be the greatest of the Musar Sfarim. The greatest of the Musar Sfarim. But he said that Rav Reisman was such a conscientious person that if he wasn't living up to the standards, it would depress him. See, unfortunately, you know, we can learn, some of us, we can learn Mesilas Yesharim, and Baruch Hashem, it doesn't affect me at all, so I can learn it. It's kind of perverse. If it doesn't affect you, then you can learn it. If it affects you, better keep away from it, because it affects you. It reminds you a little bit of a story. The Baal Tanya once told one of his Talmidim that, you know, you're hanging around the wrong people. They're bad influences, and you'll be influenced by them, so you shouldn't be with them. So he said to the Baal Tanya, Rebbe, I am impervious to influences. I've been with you for so many years, and, you know, I haven't improved. So don't worry about me. I'm not going to get worse because I don't get influenced. So the Baal Tanya said, you're making a very, very big mistake. It's much easier to be influenced for bad than it is for good. And he brought a raya from Tumah V'Taira. He says, if something is tameh, right? And if a tameh apple touches a peach that's tahor, the peach becomes tameh. So tumah can be transferred by casual contact. Now, by korbanos, the Torah says, let's say a korban chatas is kadosh, and then it says anything that kol nogeya b'fsara, anything that touches the korban chatas is tameh, like another piece of meat that's chulin. But the Gemara darshans, that doesn't mean negiah. It's only if you cooked it, so it was boleya. It has to swallow, it has to absorb. So what do you see? Tumah can be conveyed by casual contact. Purity and kedusha requires that you absorb it into your Messias. So the Baal Tanya said, the fact that you didn't absorb kedusha doesn't protect you against not absorbing tumah, because tumah can be absorbed in a much more casual way than kedusha. But Rav Pam did tell Rav Reisman that because he took the Mesilas Yesharim so seriously, and it's very hard to live up to all of the standards, he held that it would be a chisaron to learn it. Yeah, it's a chiddush, but it's something already to think about, that the tzorchei hador and even the tzrachim of yechidim in the door are going to change. Okay, so that's the idea. V'chol ma'isa hador v'hanagaseim uparnaseim. Everything the door does, and their behaviors, and their leaders will be affected by the dominant midah of Hashem, that is sholet, but then it'll be totally on their bechira of tov and ra, meaning to say they can use that midah for good or for bad, that's their bechira, but it'll be based on something in the air, a certain spiritual power in the air. No, it reminds me a little bit. Maybe I mean, here they don't quote it, but it says in the 600th year of Noach, right? The wind it says Arubei Hashemayim niftechu, right? The heavens opened up, and there was a great flood. So the Zohar HaKadosh says an amazing thing. The Zohar HaKadosh says that water is a kinoi, not only for Torah, but also for chachma, for wisdom, for technology, for science. So the Zohar says, in the 600th year of the 6th millennium, there will be potentially great chachma coming into the world. Now, let's figure this when this is. The 6th millennium began the year 5000, right? 5000 is the beginning of the 6th millennium. The 6th decade, the 6th century, begins 5500, meaning 5500 is the beginning of the 600th, the 6th century of the 6th millennium. So 5500, what year is that? Right? We're in 5784, so go 284 years ago. Where does that get you? Okay, it's supposed to correspond, I haven't looked at the dates recently, but it's supposed to correspond to the beginning of a massive industrial revolution. Steamships, technology, was pre-computers, of course, but Lamaisa, the technological advances that occurred in a short period of time were greater than had occurred 1,000 years before that, because the windows of Shemayim were open with Mayim. And with Torah too. This was an amazing tekufa of Torah knowledge. You had the Gra and Rabbi Kiva Eger, the Ketzais, the Nesivos. This was the tekufa of so many of the greatest achrayim and the like. Elamai, potentially, the Zohar says, that could have happened at the Mabul as well. The 600th year of Noach, there was going to be an opening of the windows of water. Had they been Zeicha, that water would have taken on the form of a knowledge, Chachma, Torah, whatever Torah would have meant at that time. Because of their Bechira, they took that Midah and it turned into destructive water. That's what the Gra is saying. The Gra is saying that there's a certain Midah of Hashem that shaylates, but my Maisim, my Bechira, can turn that into a good thing or a bad thing. Just like the destructive water of Mei Noach could have been the water of Chachma that in fact opened up in the 6th century of the 6th millennium, right? 500, 5600, and that whole tekufa. Okay. And then he says that there's a chazal that say HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Adam Harishain Dor Vidor Shav. Hashem showed Adam Harishain every generation and the leaders of every generation. So the Gra is masbir a little bit, although I'm not sure what the hechrich is. That doesn't mean necessarily that Adam Harishain saw specific people. Like he didn't necessarily see Rav Elyashiv or Rav Moshe Feinstein or whatever it would be, but rather he understood the midah that would be sholate in every generation and what each leader would have to do in order to bring that midah down into the world in a good way. So it's not so much that Adam Harishain saw a movie. It was a much deeper understanding. It was the Havana of how the midas of Hashem are mishapech in the course of history, and how you need a different type of response, a different type of avodah there. And that's the meaning of dor v'dorshav, every generation and its leader. Right? There has to be a different type of leader for every generation. Okay. Now, based on this, he goes further, and he says, By the way, I'm sorry, let me interrupt for a second. Is still a 6:30 Ma'ariv here, or that?
I don't know where it is, but it should
But
be.
you don't know if they're coming here or not. Okay, no, okay. Yes, we'll find out. Okay. Now then he says, "V'chein v'chol dor v'dor yesh kitzim." Now this is also a very important point. One of the Yud Gimel Ikrim is right. Amaymin b'vias hamashiach v'yafal pi sheyismameya. Even though he delays, it's been a long time. Achak eloi b'chol yaim sheyavai. I wait for him every day that he comes. So we do believe, l'chayra, Mashiach can come every day. Although it's a little ambiguous, it's not so pushing. You could learn two ways. Achak elo, I wait for him, b'chol yom sheyavo, that he can come every day. Or it just means, achak b'chol yom, every day I'm thinking about Mashiach. In other words, am I mechuyev to believe under Ikrei Emunah that Mashiach can come today? Most people seem to say, yeah. But some learn not that way. Some learn, I am mechuyev every day to pray to Hashem for Bias HaMashiach, but not that I believe he has to come today. I can believe he can come 10 years from now, whenever it is. But I'm never Mashiach Das. Okay. But let's assume you learn Kipshute, that I believe every day Mashiach can come, except on Shabbos or Erev Shabbos, or whatever it would be. And yet, we do find statements in Chazal that Mashiach will come in Nisan, Mashiach will come in Tishrei. How is it shaykh, right? I thought every day. The answer is that potentially he can come every day, but certain zamanim are more mesugal. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sets a definite time, and then we can bring it earlier. Even the idea of 6,000. 6,000 is the definite end, but we can bring it earlier, just like you could be Makabel Shabbos earlier, right? So, in fact, we're Friday afternoon right now, based on the millennia idea. So the Gra says, in every generation, without defining what he means by generation, what does generation mean? There is a designated case. Hashem has a designated day that is especially suitable for Mashiach. But that doesn't mean, in other words, more than the rest of the days. But that doesn't mean it will come, but that's the most Mesugal day. When that time passes, then it got to be reset for the next generation. But in every generation, there is a case. There is an appointed day that Hashem designated for Geula, based on our tshuva, based on our zechuyos, and based on what type of zechus a particular door needed. Because what a particular door needed to do may not be the same avodah as another door. But then he says, there is a kates acharein. Every generation has a kates, but then there's an absolute final kates that is guaranteed. And the Gra says, the difference between the kates acharein and the kitzim of every door is the kitzim of every door are toloi on tshuva, maisim tovim, and the zechuyos of that particular door. The kates ha'acharein is going to come, like it or not, ready or not. That's going to be a guaranteed thing, and that will come only out of the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the zechus avos, and that's the meaning of Shmona Esrei. Zocher chaste avos. He remembers the loving kindness of the avos. Umevi gayel livnei v'neihem. Right? He brings a redeemer to their descendants. Leman Shemai, for his name, not because of us. Bi'ahava, out of love. And that is, says the Gra, so now you have a pshat in Shmona Esrei a little bit. That is a reference to the Kates Acharein. That is not totally in Shuvah. It's totally in the Chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He combines a few things. The Chesed of Hashem, the glorifying of Hashem, and the Zechus Avos. Now, it's interesting that this is an interesting compromise, because there is a machlekes in the Gemara itself. Machlekes Tanoim. If the Geula will come only if we do tshuva, Ein Yisrael Nigalin Ela b'tshuva, or another Man D'Omer says, Yisrael are Nigalim even without tshuva. The Rambam, I think I mentioned last week, Paskins, very interesting. The Rambam says, in Hilchas Tshuva, Ein Yisrael Nigalin Ela b'tshuva, which may be bad news, right? We got to do tshuva. But then he says, the Torah promises that we will do tshuva and will be redeemed. The Gra is suggesting a third view, that the individual kates for every door will only be activated b'tshuva, but there is a kates acharein that will even be without tshuva. Now, how does that fit the two Man D'Amrim? It's not clear to me, unless he's actually saying Eilu b'Eilu Divrei Elokim Chaim, and they're not chaylik. The one that says Ein Yisrael Negalin Ela b'tshuva is referring to the kitzim of every door. That won't activate unless there's tshuva and ma'asim tovim. But Yisrael Negalin, even without tshuva, is referring to the kates acharin. Maybe that's how the Gra is learning that it's not really a machlekes. Eilu b'Eilu Divrei Elokim Chaim. Unfortunately, though, there is a downside, and that is, if the kates acharin is going to come with or without tshuva, then if we didn't do tshuva, the Chavlei Mashiach are going to have to be worse. In other words, yeah, it's going to come, but it's scary. Then it may come in a very, very, very difficult and painful way. So if you could bring the Geula through tshuva, that's a much better way to bring it than to bring it without tshuva. So it's going to come no matter what, but how it will come will certainly be a major, major difference. Now then, the Gra says that the Ketzah Acharein was niskala only to very, very few people. He says the Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu were the only people who knew the Ketzah Acharein. You remember Yaakov Avinu wanted to be Megala the Ketzah to his children, and what happened was the Ruach HaKodesh left him, and he was not able to recall it. And it's indeed, the Gra has a beautiful explanation here. In the Gemara in Sanhedrin, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu talks about the fact that nobody knows the coming of the Kates, Hashem says, L'libi gilisi, I revealed it to my heart. So most people learn that just means I'm keeping it to myself. The Gra teaches up that the Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu are called Hashem's heart. So L'libi, those who are my heart, the Avos and Moshe, I was Megala to them. They're the ones who knew it. You know, it is interesting that there actually is a letter, though, and you can see the letter. I mean, it's a letter that the Gra left to be opened up after his death. It's a short letter, it's like just half a page, in which the Gra actually says, when the Geula will come, when the Kates will come. But people are working on this now for over 100 years to try to decipher the letter. It's full of, number one, Rashi Tevis and strange gematrias, and you can make out what some words mean, but the sentences don't make normal sense in reading them and the like. But this is the Yesod. The Gra is Megala, the Yesod of Mashiach. Maybe it confirms what the Talmidim said, that he was a Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu knew. Although they tell me this, they tell me a Maisa with the Leshem. You know who the Leshem? The Leshem Shavai V'Achlama. Rav Shlomo Elyashiv, a great, great, great Makubal, who was Rav Elyashiv's grandfather. It's called the Baal HaLeshem. He came from Russia to Yerushalayim. That's when the family came. Rav Elyashiv was born in Europe. So they say when the Leshem saw the letter, the Leshem read it, and the Leshem said, anyone that knows Kabbalah, the letter is Pashut. He said, it's very clear. He says, it's very clear. So apparently, there were people who could read the letter and knew exactly what it was saying. But for most of us, again, you can see the letter. Most of us, we just don't know what it is. And he says the Ketzah Acharon is to Moshe and to the Avos, and maybe apparently there are some exceptions added to that list as well. Okay, maybe we'll stop here.